The announcement overhead called the 11:15 to Billings for the second time, before anyone in the terminal cafe even looked up. Dessa Ingram didn't look up either. She sat at a corner two-top near the window, her backpack occupying the second chair, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Outside, the flat Colorado sky pressed down hard against the distant Rockies. She'd been staring at those mountains without really seeing them. She was 28 years old and looked, in that moment, like someone who had swallowed something she couldn't name and learned to breathe around it. Dark hair pulled back without ceremony. A flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows. Jeans that had seen too many laundromats. There was a small embroidered patch on the side of her backpack, a caduceus over a pair of crossed arrows, but it was faded and easy to miss. Most things about Dessa Ingram were easy to miss. The cafe was packed. It was the week before Thanksgiving, and Denver International was doing what it always did in late November, groaning under the weight of everyone trying to be somewhere else. Every table was claimed. Business travelers typed without looking up. The line for the counter stretched past the gate entrance. "Excuse me." The voice was not a question. It came from a man standing at the edge of Dessa's table with the practiced authority of someone who had never been told no by a room. Burke Stenner was 44, tanned from somewhere tropical, wearing a jacket that probably cost more than 2 months of Dessa's salary, her former salary, anyway. Two associates flanked him, both holding coffee cups, both looking at her backpack the way a landlord looks at a late tenant. "You're sitting at a 4-top with a bag." Dessa looked up. "There's only one open seat." "The bag doesn't need a seat." He said it the way people say things they've already decided. "My colleagues and I have a call in 20 minutes and we need the table." He glanced at her flannel, her cup, her face, and performed the quick invisible calculation that men like Burke Stenner performed instinctively and rarely bothered to hide. "You look like you've been sitting here a while. Time to move." A few nearby travelers glanced over. No one intervened. Dessa set down her coffee. "I have a flight in 40 minutes, she said. Her voice was level, quiet. Stenner pulled out the chair beside her backpack, moved the bag to the floor without asking, and set his coffee down. "Great," he said. "Then stay in a different seat." The humiliation wasn't loud. That was the particular cruelty of it, the way it happened in a normal register, surrounded by the ordinary noise of an airport. Dessa picked up her backpack. She didn't argue. She had learned in the past 22 months that some battles aren't worth the oxygen. She had just started to stand when the entire cafe went quiet. Not silent, the espresso machine was still running, a child was still crying 2 gates down, but the particular conversational hum of the room dropped, the way it drops when something walks into a space that changes the air. General Clifford Oates entered the terminal cafe at 10:47, in the morning wearing his Army service uniform, the chest dense with ribbons that required a lifetime to earn. He was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried posture of a man who had stood in worse rooms than this under far worse conditions. 4 stars on each epaulette, the kind of rank that makes grown adults suddenly remember their posture. Beside him, on a short tactical leash, walked a Belgian Malinois. The dog was lean and dark-muzzled, wearing a service vest with a Department of Defense seal stitched on the side. He moved with the focused economy of a working animal, not nervous, not playful, just present and precise, amber eyes sweeping the room in a quiet professional survey. 3 men immediately moved toward the general from different directions, the instinctive magnetism of influence. A gate supervisor, a man with an airline badge, a civilian in an expensive coat who recognized the uniform and saw an opportunity. General Oates acknowledged them the way you acknowledge weather, briefly, without stopping. He stood at the entrance of the cafe for a moment. His aide spoke near his ear. The general shook his head once, a small gesture that nonetheless carried the finality of a closed door. Then the dog stopped walking. The Malinois, his name, stitched on the vest, was Toro, went still in a way that was different from a trained halt, his ears angled forward. His head dropped slightly, then rose, nostrils working in rapid, shallow pulls. His handler, a young corporal, gripped the leash tighter out of reflex. Toro took 2 steps to the left, directly away from the general's intended path, and pulled. "Sir," the corporal said, not hiding the surprise in his voice. General Oates looked down at the dog. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker of attention sharpening into focus. He had worked alongside military dogs for 30 years. He had never once seen Toro pull toward a stranger. The dog was straining toward the corner near the window. Toward the woman in the flannel shirt standing with her backpack on her shoulder, about to leave a table that a man in a designer jacket had just taken from her. General Oates walked toward her. Burke Stenner saw him coming. He arranged his face into the expression he used for networking and began to rise, extending a hand. "General, Burke Stenner, Elevate Systems. It's an honor, sir. If you need this table, we were actually just." The general walked past him as if he were a piece of carry-on luggage left in an aisle. He stopped 3 feet from Dessa. She had not moved. She stood with her backpack half on, watching the 4-star general and his military dog cross the café toward her with an expression that was not awe. It was caution. The wariness of someone who had learned that attention from authority, even well-intentioned attention, could cost something. General Oates looked at her. He took in the flannel, the worn jeans, the caduceus and crossed arrows patch on her bag. His gaze paused there. "Can I sit here?" he said. The café went still. Burke Stenner stood with his hand half extended, frozen. The gate supervisor near the entrance had stopped moving entirely. Dessa looked at the general. She looked at the table, at Stenner's coffee cup, at Stenner's associates already seated. "I was just leaving, sir. Mr. Stenner's using the table." "I didn't ask about the table," the general said. His voice was not unkind. "I asked if I could sit with you." A beat of silence. "I have a flight in 40 minutes, Dessa said. "So do I," he replied. "Gate B34. She blinked. Gate B34 was her gate. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Of course." General Oates pulled out the chair across from her. The one Stenner had taken, picked up Stenner's coffee cup without ceremony, and set it on the edge of the nearest counter. He sat. Across the café, Burke Stenner's face had turned the specific dark red of a man deciding whether the public humiliation was worth response and concluding, correctly, that it was not. The corporal with the leash began to guide Toro into a heel position, but the dog had other intentions. "Oaks," the corporal said sharply, using a secondary command. Toro did not obey. The Malinois took 3 deliberate steps toward Dessa and then, without aggression, without warning, sat directly at her feet. He lifted his muzzle to her knee and pressed it there, slow and deliberate. Then, and this was the part that made the corporal go pale and made the general go absolutely still, the dog made a sound. Low, quiet, the kind of whine that has no military application whatsoever. The sound a dog makes when it finds something it has been looking for. "Toro," the general's voice was different now. "Careful. Toro, Zeus," the stand-down command. Toro did not stand down. Dessa, acting on instinct rather than thought, slowly lowered her hand. Her fingers brushed the top of the dog's head. Toro pressed up into the touch and his tail moved once, a single slow arc, and then he placed his whole heavy chin in her lap and exhaled. General Clifford Oates sat across the table from a woman he had never met and watched his combat-decorated military working dog. A dog that had survived a vehicle IED in Kandahar and tracked high-value targets through the Korangal Valley and had never once broken discipline without a direct command. Rest his head in her lap like a dog coming home. The general's hands, folded on the table, were very still. "He's never done that," Oates said quietly, not as an accusation, as a fact that needed to be said out loud. "I can move him," Dessa said. "Don't!" He looked at her. His eyes were the gray of a November sky, and they were doing the careful work of someone constructing a theory. "What's your name?" "Dessa Ingram." Something moved across his face. Not recognition, not yet, but the shadow of it. Like hearing a piece of music you can almost name. "You were Army," he said. It wasn't a question, he'd seen the patch. Dessa was quiet for a moment. "I was." "What branch?" She looked at Toro. She scratched behind his ear. Special Forces Medical Sergeant, she said, with the particular flatness of someone reciting a fact they've made peace with. 18 Delta, 3rd Special Forces Group. I was medically separated 22 months ago. General Oates unclasped his hands. He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket slowly, with the careful movements of a man handling something fragile, and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them and smoothed it open with his palm. It was a photograph, printed on regular paper, creased from many foldings. A younger man in full combat gear, kneeling beside a tactical vehicle in a dusty landscape. He had his father's gray eyes and was grinning at whoever held the camera with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid. Underneath the photograph, handwritten in pen, Kandahar Province, September, for Mom. Dessa went very still. The cafe noise continued around them, the espresso machine, the gate announcements, the ordinary human texture of an airport at holiday. Dessa heard none of it. That is my son, General Oates said. His voice had changed completely, the command register gone, replaced by something stripped of all its armor. Captain Drew Oates, 3rd Special Forces Group. He was in a vehicle strike outside Kandahar 3 years ago. The vehicle burned. He stopped, cleared his throat once. The after-action report said the team's 18 Delta stayed with him for 11 hours under intermittent fire, treating his injuries manually when the medevac couldn't land, keeping him conscious, keeping him from going into shock. He looked at her. Drew survived. He has a titanium plate in his left femur and hearing loss in his right ear, and he starts his 2nd year of law school in January. Dessa's hands had gone motionless on the dog's head. The 18 Delta in that report, the general continued, each word measured, was medically separated 4 months after the engagement due to shrapnel injury sustained during the extraction. She declined a commendation. Told the review board she'd done her job. They sealed the specifics per her request. He was watching her face. I have spent 2 years trying to find her name. The classifications made it complicated. Last month I asked a friend at JAG to pull the separation file. Dessa was looking at the photograph of Drew Oates grinning in the Kandahar dust. She was not crying. She had learned, in 22 months of civilian life, to do most of her feeling in private. But her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, and the dog in her lap pressed harder against her, as if he understood the specific weight she was carrying. He kept asking about the dog, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Captain Oates. During the 11 hours, he kept asking if Toro was secured, if someone had gotten Toro out of the vehicle. General Oates closed his eyes for 1 second. Toro was in the rear transport, he said softly. He watched the medics work on Drew from his crate. He watched them carry out the team medic at the end of it. Dessa looked down at Toro. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on her face with an expression that had no business being on a military animal, something ancient and grieving and relieved all at once. A dog's nose holds the world differently than ours does, the general said. He remembered you. Whatever you smelled like in that vehicle, he's been carrying it 3 years. The first tear Dessa didn't stop fell before she could catch it. She pressed her fingers against Toro's muzzle, and the dog made that sound again. Low, quiet, irreplaceable, and she pressed her forehead down against his and breathed. At the table 2 feet away, Burke Stenner was not typing on his laptop anymore. No one in the immediate vicinity was doing anything except watching a 4-star general sit quietly across from a young woman in a flannel shirt while a military working dog held them both in place. General Oates gave her 2 full minutes. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't look away. When she finally straightened, he handed her a folded paper napkin from the dispenser on the table with the same matter-of-factness he would have used for a tactical briefing item. She took it. Drew wants to thank you himself, he said. He's been asking me to find you since the day he was well enough to ask for anything. He'll be angry with me for taking this long. Dessa almost smiled. How long has he known? About 6 months. He remembered more of that day than the doctors expected. The general paused. He said the medic talked to him the whole time, told him about a dog she'd had growing up, a beagle named Circuit. Dessa exhaled. Something in her chest that had been locked shifted, slow, careful, like a door that had swollen shut in the cold. He listened to that. He said it kept him awake. The general's voice was rough with something he wasn't trying to hide. Said you described that dog for 9 hours. She pressed the napkin to the corner of her eye. Circuit was a terrible dog, chewed through every phone charger we owned. I just kept adding details. General Oates laughed, a real laugh, brief and surprised, and it broke something in the formal architecture of the moment in a way that made the cafe feel briefly human again. Then Dessa's expression changed. The warmth pulled back slightly, not all the way, but enough. The general saw it happen. Ms. Ingram. She was looking at her boarding pass. I should tell you where I'm going, why I'm here. She set the pass on the table. It read, Den Bill. Billings, Montana. I accepted a position at a rural health clinic in Custer County, 40 miles from the nearest hospital. They serve a high veteran population, agricultural workers, retired military from Malmstrom. I start in 2 weeks. She folded the pass in half, or I did. What happened? The Montana state legislature approved a budget reduction package last month. The clinic is on the defunding list. They're closing it in January. Her voice was steady and clean, the voice of someone who had practiced delivering bad news without letting it break them. The land is being transferred to a private pharmaceutical distribution company. 40 veterans in that county lose their primary care access. She looked at him directly. I found out 2 days ago. I'm still going. There's a legal challenge being organized by the county health board, and I can help with documentation while it lasts. The general was no longer smiling. His jaw had taken on the quality of something cast from iron. He looked at Dessa Ingram, the woman who had talked about her beagle for 9 hours in a burning vehicle to keep his son alive, traveling on a one-way ticket to a clinic being dismantled for private real estate. What's the company? He asked. Dessa looked at him carefully. A pharmaceutical logistics firm called Meridian Distribution Partners. They have a state lobbying contract and a deal pending with the county. She paused. Their regional director is a man named Burke Stenner. The silence lasted precisely 3 seconds. General Oates turned his head. Burke Stenner was at the next table, his laptop open, pretending with insufficient conviction to be focused on his screen. What happened next was not loud. It did not need to be. The general stood. He adjusted his jacket. He walked the 4 feet to Stenner's table and stood at the man's shoulder without saying anything, until Stenner was forced by the sheer gravitational fact of it to look up. Sir, Stenner said, deploying his networking smile with diminishing returns. General, it's an honor, I run. I know who you are, Oates said. His voice was the quiet that comes before weather. Meridian Distribution, the Custer County Health Clinic reallocation. Stenner blinked. That's a private business matter. State level, completely above board. You took a table from a woman in an airport so you could make a phone call, the general said. Then, you lobbied a state legislature to take the jobs of 30 healthcare workers serving veterans so that you could build a warehouse on federal designated rural health land. He let that sit for a moment. Here is what you may not know, Mr. Stenner. The Custer County Clinic receives federal designation funding through the Health Resources and Services Administration. That makes your reallocation deal a federal compliance matter, not a state one. Your lobbyist should have mentioned that. He held eye contact 1 second longer than comfortable. In about 40 minutes, I'm boarding a plane. Between now and then, I'm going to make 3 calls. 1 to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, 1 to the senior senator from Montana, who is a personal friend, and 1 to the HRSA Office of Rural Health Policy. A pause. You might want to call your board before I land. They'll want to know before the press does. Burke, Stenner's hand had gone white around the edge of his laptop. Have a good flight, General Oates said, and walked back to Dessa's table and sat down. The cafe had heard enough of it to understand the shape of what had just happened. Nobody moved, exactly, but the quality of the silence had changed. Dessa was watching him. General, you don't have to. 3 calls, he said, pulling out his phone. Give me the clinic director's name and the county health board contact, she told him. He made the calls. She heard his end of the first one, brief, precise, the particular language of a man who knows which doors to open and how hard to push. The second call lasted 4 minutes. On the third, he stepped just outside the café entrance, and Dessa watched through the glass as he stood with his back to the terminal, speaking with the controlled authority of someone accustomed to outcomes. Toro stayed with her. The dog had not moved from her feet the entire time. His chin was on her boot. His amber eyes tracked the general through the glass and came back to Dessa and tracked again. The attentive monitoring of a dog doing the only thing it knew how to do for the people it loved. When the general returned, his expression had the specific quality of a man who has moved what needed moving. The HRSA compliance issue is real, he said, sitting back down. The relocation can't proceed during an active federal review. That buys the county health board time to make its legal case properly. He folded his hands. It's not a guarantee, but it's no longer a foregone conclusion. Dessa was quiet for a moment. That's more than I had this morning. I want to talk to you about something else. He looked at her steadily. I've been working for 14 months with the VA on a veteran wellness and trauma recovery expansion. We're building out regional centers across the Mountain West. We need a director of clinical operations at the hub, someone with combat trauma experience, field medicine background, and the ability to work with veterans who don't trust hospitals. He paused, someone who knows what 11 hours in a burning vehicle actually feels like. Dessa looked at the boarding pass on the table. Billings, Montana. I haven't practiced acute care medicine in nearly 2 years, she said. This isn't acute care. It's longitudinal recovery support, peer relationships, canine therapy integration. His eyes moved briefly to Toro. Your background is exactly what the program needs. She looked at the dog. Toro looked back at her with those amber eyes that had been holding something for 3 years, waiting for the right place to set it down. What happens to Toro? She asked. Toro was scheduled for formal retirement at the end of this month. 22 months of active deployment, a confirmed combat injury, and what the veterinary staff is calling selective responsiveness since Drew's accident. The general looked at his dog with the expression of someone who has loved something for a very long time. They mean he doesn't respond to new handlers the way he used to. He completes his protocols, but he hasn't. He paused. He hasn't done what he did today. Not in 3 years. Not with anyone. He picked up Toro's leash from the floor where it had gone slack. He held it out across the table. Dessa Ingram looked at the leash. She looked at the 4-star general across from her, who was not offering charity. He was returning something that belonged to her, or rather, something that had decided for itself where it belonged. She took the leash. Toro's tail moved, not the single slow arc from before, but a real wag, full and unhesitating. The dog pressed his entire side against her shin and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Drew will call today, the general said. He'll probably call before we land. She found, somewhere she hadn't expected to find it, a small steady thing that felt like the beginning of forward. She tucked it away carefully, the way you tuck away something you mean to come back to. Around them, the terminal cafe resumed its ordinary business. The espresso machine, the gate announcements, the Thanksgiving travelers redistributing themselves toward their departures. Burke Stenner had closed his laptop and left the table without making eye contact with anyone. Gate B34 began its boarding announcement overhead. General Clifford Oates stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand. Dessa Ingram shook it, the handshake of 2 soldiers, though only one of them was still uniformed. I'll expect your decision on the position by end of week, he said. Yes, sir. She followed him out of the cafe into the wide terminal corridor. Toro, walking at her left side, with the quiet authority of a dog who had found his assignment and intended to keep it. The mountains outside the window were still there, pressing up against the Colorado sky, and Dessa looked at them this time and actually saw them, for what they were and for what they weren't. They were not the last thing she had. They were just mountains. 2.5 years ago, she had driven 9 hours to keep a man she'd never met alive inside a vehicle that was trying to become his coffin. She had not thought of it as heroism. She had thought of it as arithmetic, the math, of keeping a heart beating long enough to hand it to someone else. She had not known in those 11 hours whether the math had worked. Now she did. She walked toward gate B34, and Toro walked beside her, and the weight she'd been breathing around for 22 months was still theirs. It didn't simply vanish, because that is not how the actual world works. But it had shifted, the way a carried thing shifts when someone else finally puts their hand on it. Not gone, shared. Which is, in the end, the only way any of it ever gets lighter.